welcome to our rolling coverage of the war here in Israel. I'm Nicole Zedek, live in Tel Aviv. It's been 20 days since Hamas's full-scale attack on Israel. Overnight rockets from Gaza continue to target central Israel, with several people in Rishon LeZion and Petah Tikva injured by rocket shrapnel. Now, as the Iron Dome intercepts rockets from the south, Israel's air defense systems also intercepted a missile launched towards the north from Lebanon, after leaders of three main terror groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, held a meeting in Beirut. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addresses the nation, stating while the #1 priority right now is eliminating Hamas, once the war is won, Israel will have some major questions to answer.
We are bringing down lethal fire on Hamas. We've already killed off thousands of terrorists, and this is just the beginning. And we're also preparing for the ground offensive. I'm not going to give any specifics on when, how, and how much. I'm also not going to specify the various considerations we're taking into account. Many of these considerations are not known to the general population in Israel, and that's a good thing because we want to protect our soldiers' lives. I would like to be clear. The timing of the IDF operation was determined unanimously by the cabinet in charge of this war, together with the Chief of General Staff, and together with the cabinet, we operate in order to guarantee the most optimal conditions for our troops for the upcoming activities. And when we get into Gaza, and then later on, we're going to get those murderers who committed these horrific events of Hamas, ISIS, to pay the full price. October 7th was a very dark and black day in our history. We will fully investigate what had happened at our southern border, the border with Gaza. Everybody will have to provide answers, myself included, but all that will happen only after the war.
Now, as Netanyahu addresses the public, so does his Western ally, U.S. President Joe Biden. Biden continues to stand behind the state of Israel, but recognizes the country will never look the same following the October 7th massacre.
There's no going back to the status quo as it stood on October the 6th. That means ensuring Hamas can no longer terrorize Israel and use Palestinian civilians as human shields. It also means that when this crisis is over, there has to be a vision of what comes next. And in our view, it has to be a two-state solution. It means a concentrated effort for all the parties, Israelis, Palestinians, regional partners, global leaders, to put us on a path toward peace.
As President Biden continues to support Israel in its goal of destroying Hamas, U.S. Congress is stepping up as well. The new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, called up a resolution supporting Israel in his first action as leader of the House of Representatives. The non-binding measure was backed by a vote of 412 to 10 and reaffirms U.S. commitment to Israel while calling on Hamas to immediately cease attacks and release every hostage.
This resolution condemns Hamas and Iran for its support of terrorist groups, such as Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, while also calling for all sanctions on Iran to be fully enforced. So I urge my colleagues to support this important resolution. It will send a clear message across the world that terrorists and their sponsors will be held to account for their atrocities, their crimes against humanity, their crimes of genocide.
I want to bring in my guest now, retired Colonel Miri Eisen, director of the International Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University. Miri, thank you so much for joining us. The U.S. is continuing to show their support. We know 2 aircraft carriers still in the region, fighter squadrons, now also these politicians really stepping up. But how long will this support stay, and how major is it really to have such Western allies showing their support for Israel?
I'm not sure all of us really grasp yet right now how much the world changed on October 7th, because the frame so much right now is Israel against the Hamas terrorist group, and in the international community, a different frame. The United States, President Biden, all of Congress, let's not focus on the nays. Let's focus on the 420 that's like a kind of thing that you cannot imagine, that understand that October 7th was an event that changed all of the world, that Hamas type of terrorism, homegrown, the challenges within that world is something that everybody needs to deal with. I think that this will last a long time because what Hamas did and is continuing to do, as you said, we're on the 20th day, it isn't over. They're trying to continue to do both the attacks and the rockets and the atrocities. That's something which is understood by leaderships around the world.
We certainly are just in the beginning, as you state, Mary. I'm curious, though, as we continue to see this support from Western allies, and you say this is going to be a long-standing support because they're recognizing the threat that these terror groups, these Iranian-backed terror groups, pose to not only Israel, but all of these Western allies. So with their continued support, is now truly the time to be striking these Iranian proxies because we have a hand pushing us forward.
There's no question that in that sense, this context of the West Bank and of the Gaza Strip, and Nicole, I'm breathing in deep, me who always has to breathe in deep, and also saying, and East Jerusalem, because East Jerusalemites in that sense are much more like the West Bank than they are like the state of Israel. So that we have three different arenas that are going to be reshaped. I'm not leaving it for after the war. I think that right now, this fight against Hamas is not just against the terror capabilities and atrocities. It's also in that sense of that basic support that we saw so clearly, that the goal of Hamas is not just to annihilate the Israeli state, to annihilate the Jewish state. Those are like the terms that they write in their charter. We saw what they do. It's about murdering, butchering, atrocities against Jews in the Israeli state. And we do not want that to be the ideology that people want to follow. I support two states the way that President Biden said so. And I say you have to show that that terrorism and the ideology that calls for our eradication and atrocities is not one that you are going to support. So it's a new future, and we need to see alternative ideas. And I can hope that out of the horrifying pictures and the horrifying things that Hamas did, the decent people will look for a different way. It isn't easy.
Mary Eisen, thank you. I want you to stay with us, but as you're talking about those horrifying scenes, I want us to actually turn our eyes to the south, where our correspondent, Pierre Clochindler, I-24 News correspondent, is right now in southern Israel. Pierre, overnight we continue to see major strikes targeting Gaza overnight. The IDF spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, even saying that this is all in preparation for the ground operation.
Right, and we just got confirmation by the IDF spokesperson Unity, in which they said that a combined force of tanks and infantry, Givati Brigade, made an incursion into the Gaza Strip in order to prepare the battleground for a further in-depth incursion of the IDF inside the Gaza Strip, in which they neutralized terrorists, anti-tank posts, and other things, other obstacles, and the forces returned safely to Israeli territory. In the night, there were many airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, according to Palestinian reports. We know that tunnels have been neutralized in the western area of Gaza City. Buildings used by Hamas as command posts, as well as tunnel shafts, have been also targeted. And at the same time, the latest alert on Israeli territory, rocket alert, was at 10 o'clock when a rocket barrage hit the vicinity of Ashkelon and Ashdod, two cities in southern Israel. And at 9:30 p.m. local time, there was a heavy rocket barrage on two cities in central Israel, Rishon LeZion and Petach Tikva. A rocket with a 60-kilogram warhead hit an old building with no private shelters. By chance, by miracle, in this rocket barrage, there were only 6 people lightly wounded and a few others who were stricken by anxiety. People rushed to collective shelters. The building in Rishon LeZion, which suffered a direct impact, was devastated. But again, only 6 Israelis lightly wounded in that rocket attack. And since 10 p.m., it's quiet on Israeli territory.
A tense quiet, knowing that it could change at any moment. Pierre, you're talking about these long-range rockets continuing to target central Israel 19, 20 days since the initial attack. A lot of people are wondering, when are they going to first run out of rockets and next run out of fuel? I'm curious, as Israel continues to prepare for this ground operation, but continues to delay the ground operation, how has Hamas prepared for this? Were they prepared to stay in those underground tunnels for nearly 3 weeks now?
We know that Hamas's attack, slaughter on Israel in October 7 was prepared very much in advance. Tasmin news agency from Iran speaks about 4 years of preparation. Others are talking about at least 1 year of preparation. So when you prepare your forces, you also prepare the infrastructure for those forces. Israel argues that there is no lack of fuel inside Gaza, but the flow of humanitarian aid, which is critical for the civilians not involved in the fighting in the Gaza Strip, is only a trickle at this moment. Yesterday, there was no entrance of humanitarian aid, of food, medicine, and water inside Gaza. And that's part also possibly of the waiting period everybody is caught into, the waiting period for a ground major incursion into the Gaza Strip by the IDF. First of all, the hostage issue, and also humanitarian aid, and the fact that there are still non-involved civilians in the northern part of the Gaza Strip, in spite of the IDF and the Israeli government urging civilians in Gaza to move south of Gaza City.
And we'll continue to keep our eye on there, as it is mainly a tense waiting game for now. Pierre Clochon, thank you for bringing us the latest from southern Israel. And from the south, I also want to move to our correspondent in the north. Pia Stekelbach is standing by right now. Pia, overnight we see that the IDF continuing to strike terror cells in southern Lebanon, even fighter jets destroying some Hezbollah military compound. What can you tell us?
Right, Nicole, overnight the Israeli military said that it struck the origin of where a surface-to-air missile was fired toward an Israeli drone in southern Lebanon. It's interesting because when we are talking about those continuous skirmishes between Israel and Hezbollah, we are mostly talking about anti-tank missiles and mortar shells. Now, this surface-to-ground missile was launched towards an Israeli drone. Yesterday, the Israeli military said that it struck at least 3 squads in southern Lebanon trying to fire those anti-tank missiles. One of them succeeded in firing one towards an Israeli army base in the area of Avivim, which is fairly close to the Israeli-Lebanese border. Now, when we look at the north, we also have to keep an eye at what comes out of the south, because yesterday afternoon a rocket was launched by Hamas from the Gaza Strip into the area of Haifa. That rocket exploded mid-air, so no interception there was needed and no casualties or injuries reported there. But if you needed any more proof that the fronts are actually in fact connected, there was yesterday morning a meeting that Hezbollah itself published about, a meeting between Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah together with the leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Ziad al-Nakhle, and one of the most senior Hamas officials, Saleh al-Aruri, in Beirut, which means that Iran is there trying to send a signal that it is trying to keep its proxies together there. That meeting, as Hezbollah-friendly media said, was in order to discuss the further steps that need to be taken in that sensitive stage of the war now, and how to bring about what they said the victory of the Palestinian resistance in Gaza there. We have seen that Hezbollah throughout the year really was trying to emphasize that its goal was to combine the fronts, to combine its own cause and the Palestinian resistance in Gaza and the West Bank. And if you needed any more proof, then you had it there yesterday with that meeting that comes about 2 weeks after the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah also met in Beirut with the Iranian foreign minister there. So that really shows you how much also Hezbollah wants to showcase that it is cooperating with the Palestinians here as that northern front continues to heat up, Nicole.
Pia Stekelbach will continue to keep our eye up there on the northern front. Thank you for bringing us all of that coverage. Now I want to bring in my guest in studio now. I'm joined by senior diplomatic correspondent Owen Alterman. Owen, quite a lot to discuss about just the international impact on this as well. But quickly, before we unpack it all, I want to come back to our guest, retired Colonel Miri Eisen, just to talk about, after speaking to our two correspondents, we have them up in the north, down in the south as well. Quite a lot to unpack, Miri. But specifically, as we're seeing just more signs that Hezbollah, Hamas, PIJ, they are absolutely all interconnected and working together to continue to fight this war against Israel.
If you want to put the picture back again of the meeting yesterday of Hassan Nasrallah together with the head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the number 2 to 3 in Hamas who lives in Beirut and in Qatar, and he used to be a lot in Turkey, that's Salah al-Aouri. If you put that photo up again, just take note, everybody, of the photos that are on the wall, because the photos on the wall are not of the Lebanese in any way. It is of Khomeini and Khamenei. It is the leaders of the Iranian Revolution, the present religious leader, the founder of that. And I say that in the background.
Miri Eisen, it truly is interesting just seeing the entire United States response from this. I want to bring in, once again, Owen Alterman joining me in studio. After hearing from Miri and just about how much the United States and our Western allies and Europe have to lose from this, especially as we continue to see how clearly Iran is involved.
Right. Well, a couple thoughts. First of all, obviously, Miri's right about the coordination between these groups. And what that means is, Nicole, almost by definition, Israel's strategy should be, and frankly is, to try to drive wedges between them because, of course, their interests aren't exactly aligned, particularly Hezbollah, right? We've seen just how little Hamas cares about the civilians in Gaza, right? And the way Hamas treats the civilians in Gaza. With Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's more complicated. Nasrallah seems to have, and I say this with some caution, seems to have more commitment to his Shiite community base, and he also has to worry about the other communities in Lebanon, because on the day after the war, the Shia, his tribe, if you will, in Lebanon, the Shia sector, the Shia community, is going to have to live with the rest of the Lebanese public, and he knows he has to worry about that, and that restrains him, and Israel uses that as part of its strategy, right? Iran also has a wider strategy even beyond these groups, of course, a hate-filled and strategy that is trying to advance Iran's interests, but Israel can also drive that wedge as well. As for support in the West, look, of course it's about the issue of radical Islam and the issue about extremism in the Middle East, but of course it's much larger, right? The American commitment to Israel is a marker of America's commitment to its allies around the world. Joe Biden has made that argument just about explicitly, right? By linking the fight here in Israel to the fight in Ukraine and linking America's commitment to Israel to America's commitment to Ukraine and, for that matter, Taiwan and to allies around the world. And Joe Biden clearly sees this as a test that's going to be watched around the world about just how committed the United States is to its allies, to its network of allies. So the stakes here are not just local here in Israel or even regional, they're very much global.
And it's not just the United States now really speaking up. I mean, we saw the first resolution that the House Speaker passed in favor of Israel. However, I'm curious, is Israel or the United States truly speaking up right now, especially sending an important message in contradiction to what we've heard from the United Nations?
Well, first of all, just very quickly, what happened in the House. You're right, there was the resolution that passed, but the question is about the money, right? Joe Biden has asked for $14 billion in aid for Israel. There's consensus in the House to support that, so that's not the issue. The issue is tactical for the Republicans about whether this is going to need to be bundled with aid for Ukraine, which in their view is more controversial, or passed as a standalone. So we'll have to wait to see how that plays out. But of course, Nicole, what's happened at the United Nations over the past few days has made headlines here. There's a long history of relations between Israel and the UN, but this may be a new low. The comments 2 days ago by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, all of the fallout and the storm that have come after that. Take a look at this report, which gives you a bit of the latest. Even for Israel at the United Nations, it's a new low, with continued anger in Israel Wednesday over the comments of Secretary General Antonio Guterres in New York a day earlier.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation.
Mr. Secretary General, in what world do you live? Definitely, this is not our world. Saturday, October 7, will go down in history as nothing less than a brutal massacre.
Families of Israeli hostages went ahead Tuesday with their meeting with Guterres, but Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen canceled his meeting. Israel began denying visas to UN officials. Ambassador to the UN Gilad Erdan called for Guterres to resign. And the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Wednesday had this to say.
Those who seek to understand look for a justifying context, do not categorically condemn the perpetrators, and do not call for the unconditional and immediate release of the abducted, fail the test. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres failed the test.
Guterres took to the podium Wednesday to explain. Israel remained unimpressed.
I am shocked by the misrepresentations by some of my statement yesterday in the Security Council, as if I was justifying acts of terror by Hamas. This is false. It was the opposite.
Israel and UN institutions have had tense relations for decades, with Israel feeling UN bodies and UN officials do not give Israel's claims a fair hearing, that the United Nations has a deep-rooted anti-Israel culture. That has not always tainted the Secretary General himself, which is why the fury over Guterres' comments is news. And the storm comes at a sensitive time, with UN agencies a key force in the Gaza Strip, making this a high-stakes diplomatic fight for all involved.
Owen, you said it yourself in this report. The United Nations has a long-standing history of being anti-Israel, spreading anti-Israel rhetoric. So does this really come as a surprise to anyone hearing from the UN Security General?
Yes, it does. It does, because Nicole, realize that the UN isn't one thing, it's many things. It's a sprawling organization with all kinds of bodies and all kinds of groups, some of which Israel has very, very difficult relations with. For example, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, of course, UNRWA, which we're seeing before our eyes in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere, and others. But there are other parts of the United Nations that Israel works with seamlessly, and there are UN agencies doing really important work on food, on health and technology, and others. Something like this from the Secretary General himself is not the standard, and that's why it's gotten such a sharp reaction across the political spectrum here in Israel.
24 News senior diplomatic correspondent Owen Alterman, as always, thank you for breaking this down. I want to quickly come back to our retired Colonel Miri Eisen just to break it down as we continue to look at the UN even vetoing a resolution that condemned Hamas to free Israeli hostages held in the Gaza Strip. It's not going to happen from the UN. So as this continues to move forward, we're lacking that support from the United Nations.
Not just from the United Nations. Why was it vetoed? And let's remember that Russia, China, they have that veto capability as well. This is both the United Nations. It's also about big countries who are not on our side. And when I say not on our side, they have not in any words condemned what's happened. Let's stay on the high moral ground and continue to say our truth and our morals.
And that's what all we can do. Retired Colonel Miri Eisen, thank you so much for joining us, as always, providing your insight, as well as I-24 News senior diplomatic correspondent Owen Alterman. Quite a lot to break down here as we continue to look at the developments of day 20 of the war here in Israel. Thanks for tuning in.